the West, because in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was an ally of the West. The West gave him chemical weapons and all sorts of other conventional weapons to fight Iran. So this group, the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, as they call themselves, this cult was used by the Israelis with American consent to carry out espionage, to gather intelligence for operations, and also to carry out terror attacks in the country. So we also then saw assassinations of other people, like the Deputy Minister of Defense, and also the Israelis constantly in support of ISIS and Al-Qaeda during the dirty war in Syria. And I think nowadays everyone better understands what was happening in the previous decade in Syria. The dirty war in Syria was carried out by NATO and regional allies to break the link between Iran and the resistance, to break the bridge. And regional countries did a deal with the devil. Mr. Erdogan would get a piece of the cake, but Syria would be basically a broken country controlled by the West. In Syria, when ISIS and Al-Qaeda were advancing in 2013, the Iranians got involved. They were not involved for the first couple of years at all, nor was Hezbollah. Only when ISIS and Al-Qaeda had brought in tens of thousands of foreign fighters, many of them from Europe, only then did they get involved to prevent these terror groups from gaining the upper hand and planting their black flags over Damascus and later Baghdad. When Iranian troops were here in Syria, the Israelis would regularly bomb them in support of these terror organizations. And so Iran, throughout these years, showed strategic patience. And then, of course, we had the terror attack on the Iranian embassy, where a number of Iranians were murdered in Damascus, and the United States, France, Britain, and Germany, they all at the UN Security Council supported Israel. In other words, they supported the airstrike on the Iranian embassy. So Iran had no option but to carry out a retaliation. Now, back then, if you recall, when Iran carried out the retaliation, many in the West ridiculed Iran. But as I said back then, the Iranians carried out this attack to force the Israelis and mostly the Americans, because the heavy duty work is done by the Americans. The heavy lifting is done by the Americans when it comes to surface to air capabilities. In general, the Israelis don't really, on their own, they're nothing. It's in any area. It's the Americans really that fund it, that support it, and that stand behind them. All these bunker busters, all these bombs that they're bombing day and every day, planes are coming in to help them slaughter women and children. So in Syria, when this happened, the Iranians retaliated, and Iran fired 300 or so drones and missiles. Most of the drones were old drones. Most of the missiles were old missiles. And the reason was, not only did Iran want to force them to fire everything they had and spend billions of dollars, but more importantly, the Iranians wanted to gather intelligence to see what capabilities they had, so that next time round, if necessary, Iranian missiles and drones could be fired in a way in which they would have maximum effect. So again, when the Israeli regime murdered martyr Haniyeh in Tehran, who was a guest, and I'm sorry if I'm tiring your guest, but I think these are all important. When they murdered the martyr Ismail Haniyeh, who was the political head of Hamas, when they murdered him in Tehran, at that time he came to Tehran as a guest of the president-elect. And he was in his inauguration, and they hugged. And later on, he was murdered in Tehran in an official guest house. So when the Iranians took that to the UN Security Council, again, the United States, France, Britain, and Germany supported Israel. So terrorism in Iran is allowed, bombing Iranian embassies is allowed, the Iranians decided that obviously they have to retaliate. That retaliation took some time. Some people were critical of it. I have I have no real comment to make on that at this stage because I really don't know what goes on behind those closed doors. Some some say they do, but I'm skeptical about some claims made by people because I think some of them probably have even less access than me. But in any case, part of the delay was because of the negotiations over the ceasefire, even though the Iranians knew that the United States was lying and that there were no plans for a ceasefire. But the calculation was, and this is something that the martyr Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah said in a speech that he made when they carried out their retaliation. He said, "We waited because of the negotiations." And what is the problem of not waiting? Because if, for example, the Americans, uh, if they, while they were supposedly negotiating, even if the Iranians carried out the attack, the Americans, the Europeans, the Israelis, and regional countries would all suddenly say that we're on the verge of an agreement. We're about to end the bloodshed. We're going to save Palestinian lives. But these Iranians did not want peace, and they proved that they want to sacrifice Palestinian women and children for their own interests. So, which of course was a lie, would have been a lie, but that's exactly what they would have done. And it would have had a huge impact, I think. So part of the delay was because of that. There are other calculations which I could get into, but it's speculation. Uh, Iran preparing itself for defense uh, in case when Iran ultimately attacks. But I'll leave it at that for now on. What I can say is that the Iranians believe that an Israeli response is almost inevitable. When they carried out the attack, that was the expectation. But regardless of the nature of the Israeli strike and how uh, large it is, and have no doubt that it will be carried out with full American support and full coordination. If the Americans say don't do this, and then the Israelis say, well, we're going to do, we may do it, that's all for show. They are cooperating at every level in their attacks on Iran. In their attacks on Lebanon, it is American intelligence and the Five Eyes that are used to find underground uh, bunkers or bases in Damascus. It is Western embassies, Western NGOs, many Western journalists who, over the last couple of decades, have been gathering intelligence, along with the many refugees who pass through the country. Many of them could be used to gather intelligence. They've been working and collaborating together throughout these years, and over the last year in particular, and in the case of Lebanon, over the last month, we know American planes and drones fly alongside Gaza. Everything that is being done in Lebanon, in Gaza, is being done with the help of U.S. and European and British intelligence. And the strike that will be carried out against Iran will be in full coordination with the United States. And it's complete nonsense if the Americans go out and say we didn't want this and they did something else. The Americans and the Israelis are cooperating together at all levels and on all operations, with regards to all operations. And this is not new. This is exactly what the Americans did after 9/11. The Americans, they invaded Afghanistan, then Iraq, then you had, Libya, then you had Yemen. They supported the Saudis. The Americans, they lost on all accounts. And in Syria, they engaged in a dirty war. They keep saying Assad killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. No, they killed hundreds of thousands. That NATO countries and regional countries together, they bear more responsibility than this, far more responsibility than the Syrian government, because they were violating Syrian sovereignty. But in any case, the point is that the United States was not making reasonable decisions. If the United States was uh, analyzing the situation rationally, there would never have been a war on Iraq. And by the way, Netanyahu, we always have to remember, Israel doesn't care about the United States. Israel doesn't care about the West. Israel only cares about itself. Netanyahu, you recall, said 9/11 was good for Israel. He also, Netanyahu, was a strong advocate of the Iraq War. Did the Israelis help the Americans in the Iraq War? Did they make any sacrifices for the Americans anywhere? Did they send troops anywhere? Did they fight alongside the Americans in Afghanistan? Or no, it's the Americans paid the price. The Israelis, from their own perspective, reaped the benefits, and the Americans paid the price. Even the electronic devices, right, that they used, they weaponized. Who do you think is sacrificed here? It's Western businesses, Western products. I, for one, am not going to buy anything, any electronic uh, goods produced by Korea, Japan,